So let's talk about a few slightly lesser loved rules mechanics in Warhammer 40k. Things that have been purged from Warhammer 40k's past, ones that I'm quite happy to leave as relics of history. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we could take a look at a few things that have disappeared from the past of 40k's history. Rules organisation things and mechanics that I personally wasn't too unhappy to see the back of, and maybe just a few indications of some of the more obvious ways in which Games Workshop has improved in trying to offer a bit more of a modern wargame, even if the exact styling and delivery might not please everyone with each new edition that they come out with. Jumping straight into it, and for a bit more of a rules delivery point of view, one thing that I'm glad to see consigned to the scrap heap of history are the points section from 8th edition. 8th edition kind of felt like a turning point, where Games Workshop really quite radically overhauled the game, and it brought a lot of new players into Warhammer 40k as a result. I feel like a lot of their ideas they did kind of well, but there's quite a few bits of game design that in hindsight look kind of terrible in their own way, and the points layout system I think was maybe one of the most obvious ones. The way it'd work is that you'd have a few pages of points in the codex, and rather than in the 9th edition sort of way where you had the unit name and then points per model and then points per any bits of war gear all in the same place, Games Workshop in 8th edition opted for a kind of horrendous table worth of points values. The unit names and the points per model were sensible enough laid out in these tables here, but it was the mix between that and the tables of war gear that really made it sort of painful to operate. The pieces of war gear were often on a different page and nowhere near the actual things of the unit, so you basically had to hunt through really quite a long list of war gear options to see if your unit had any of those bits on them. None of the bits were actually specific to the units that could take them, so say if you had a ballistic skill 3+ unit and a ballistic skill 4+ unit, they'd still both be paying the same amounts to say upgrades to a multi-melter or something like that. So often meant that some choices were just far better for certain units than others, though I guess that has often been the case in 40k's history. But then probably the bit that made it just extra painful was that it included some default gear, some things that the squad just couldn't take otherwise because they were a maybe option on another unit, maybe some things like fancy grenades for example, and also the fact that you basically had to take a look at every single piece of war gear that the squad was equipped with and check whether or not it was actually present in the table or not, as if it wasn't listed then it was basically free, but you wouldn't know that until you had sifted through every set of points. In general, you could use things like Battlescribe or Warhapedia and things, or just have used those units so many times so you know which points you need to pay for them and which bits of generic war gear you needed to pay for each time, but it certainly felt like a pretty painful way of delivering printed points cost. I think that basically everyone breathed a sigh of relief in 9th edition, where you basically just had the unit entry and then the points cost for bits of war gear listed under it, so you'd have all the points cost for one unit in one place, and it meant that you could have different points costs for units where the upgrade was radically different in power for them. Of course, 10th edition has solved that entire problem in its own slightly dubious way by just making all war gear free, which definitely isn't a universally popular thing. It does mean points, army construction and balance things are super simplistic, but also creates problems with each bit of war gear theoretically having to be balanced against each other, and default loadouts for a squad kind of being bad now. Sticking with the same bit though, I feel like the way that they were dispensed was kind of equally awful in its own way. The way they settled into was twice yearly chapter approved books, where they basically have every single faction in the game printed out in these massive reams of tables, and then expect people to buy those, even if your own faction might have some very minimal points tweaks. I remember one particularly bad example when the Tau Empire were kind of struggling for how they were doing in game and got something like a 1-point adjustment to the Riptide or something like that, and that was the only update that they got. The paper points delivery system was just bad on so many levels, just felt super painful to be paying good money for literally a few changes in points values. They occasionally tried to bundle them with a few different missions and things like that, though I still think it was painful just to have so much of a book basically be waste paper as soon as you'd read and decanted the points values. And what's more, because the books were essentially had to be written and printed something like 6+ months prior to them coming out, it meant that the points changes were basically aimed at a meta that was then 6 months out of date post any other codex releases that had come out between then. So quite a lot of the time, as well as fixing problems, they'd also just continued to dunk on armies that had basically changed into not being a problem anymore, and completely miss armies that were thoroughly stomping the meta flat. I feel like swapping this system out for free digital updates was really quite a nice idea. Before we go on, I just wanted to quickly shout out the Channel Armies 3D printed offerings for this month. For the oppressive ranks of the Iron Enforcers, For July, the miniature offering is an oppressor transport vehicle and some heavy assault segways. The transport vehicle is a fun and modular one with a lot of different weapon choices, a front assault ramp and a detailed interior. It's $7 for the subscription for the STLs with the code ATL30 or $45 for one miniature from Wargame Portal in the USA. And there's also the slightly mad assault Segway riders as well, equipped with dual Gatling guns and taser lancers. They're also included in the monthly subscription for $7 or $34 for 5 miniatures from Wargame Portal. There's also a couple of free miniature offerings of the month as well. They're linked on Thangs in the video description. STL designs for a single Segway patrolman or a tank commander, so feel free to check those out down in the video description. Back to the subject at hand though, another thing that I think Games Workshop has really made some good progress on is to actually have terrain rules that really are impactful and actually manage to have really quite a big impact on the game, meaning that if you're hiding behind them, then genuinely it's going to protect you from shooting, as opposed to the entire battlefield basically being an open shooting gallery. Again, I've made me feel like this was perhaps most apparent in 8th edition for me, after the game's enormous reset from the mess that was 7th edition. Basically the only thing that terrain tended to give was a +1 to your saving throws. Definitely not the worst idea with the game's AP system being redone, but with the game going to very much true line of sight rules on basically everything, it kind of meant that you could still shoot just about anything with anything across the entire board on a bunch of terrain setups, even if the lines of sight that you could draw were really janky ones, like say under a tree, through a window, and then through 2 other units to see another model. So it meant that unless you were playing with a bunch of ruins or something that had really massive physically blocking walls that literally had no windows or anything in them, then the terrain rules just might not do that much. And you could have models hidden in really dense terrain, but still not really able to hide every single bit of them. So even if you could just see the tiniest part of one model through a window or something, you could still basically fire at them to full effect. It basically meant that unless you were playing with terrain that was very specifically built to have no gaps in it at all, or you were doing some sort of house rule like ground floor ruins basically have no windows in as a house rule invented by the ITC, then you kind of just have to accept that most things on the board could see and shoot most other things, and in general it just tended to mean that you basically needed range on things, and then you'd still be able to fire at good effect unless you were playing on a super dense board with specific terrain. I think it was one of the major reasons why 8th edition tended to favour shooting armies a fair bit more so than melee armies. Night fighting rules in the early game could help a bit, but maybe not loads. And I must admit I think it was quite a good development when Games Workshop decided to introduce obscuring ruins in 9th edition, basically doing their own way of making ruins actually block line of sight, so you could actually have some fragile units on the board and not just immediately have them gunned down by some enemy army's big gun line. I think it perhaps shows an improvement that actual competitive events and things are playing with Games Workshop's own rule set and not tacky on bolt-on type rules, just to make things work for terrain sets that often have windows and other cool things in, and make the game a bit more playable. I still think that maybe Games Workshop has a bit of an overfixation on ruins as the most functional game terrain piece, and perhaps could afford to do a bit more with other sets of things as well. Though I do certainly like it that they're a lot more impactful than they used to be, and you can genuinely hide fragile units and give people tough decisions as to whether or not they move to go around and shoot them, or whether or not that's too much of an overextension. Another mechanic that I found kind of fun, but also at the same time just didn't really seem like a very good idea, was Seize the Initiative in at least one of its incarnations. The idea often was that you basically knew who was going first, in some incarnations of the game alternating deployment zone drops, or in other incarnations rolling off and one person deploys their entire army, and then the player who's in theory supposed to be going second would roll a dice just before the game started. If they could roll a 6, then they'd seize the initiative and their army would go first. Definitely could be a fun little dramatic moment, but also meant that, at least in some incarnations of the game, you could just get a horribly skewed game where one person has a ridiculous advantage. I think in the chapter approved version before it went away, the general way that it went was that you'd determine who basically was deploying their army and going first in one single roll. So basically the player who was going first would deploy their entire army, and then the opposing player would perfectly counter-deploy to that, so they know exactly where the enemy's army is, and then they get to set up their units in return, so you can see what units are on the board and how you might counter them by, say, having your units out of line of sight, or getting things ready to strike on the enemy's tough stuff. I felt like the trade-off for that wasn't too bad, as it meant that one player got the advantage of going first, which was a much bigger thing back at the time, but the other player got to deploy a bit better, and things could actually even out quite well. If the player going second though decided that they wanted the advantage of going first as well, and they managed to seize the initiative, it meant that you potentially could have the situation where one army had basically perfectly counter-deployed their foe, and then also managed to get first turn as well, potentially getting the alpha strike on their army too, so kind of doubling down on just a really skewed game. And if things were close before, at least in a game where you had two heavy shooting armies on both sides, it probably wouldn't be close after that. I definitely remember experiencing that on the time. In one tournament game that was shaping up to be kind of close, I managed to seize the initiative and just absolutely wrecked an enemy army that was out in the open for the most part, as it did make sense to capitalise on the 5 out of 6 advantage that they were going to be going first. A 1 out of 6 chance just wasn't really enough to warrant playing conservatively for. But whenever it does come up, it basically just turned into a game where you had pretty maximal imbalance. Unless that imbalance helped out a player who was behind, it might just help out a player who was already probably odds on to win the matchup and just help them win more. Again, I wasn't really too disappointed to see this one go away. I feel like the way that you have now, where it's just a bit more random but the terrain rules are more impactful, so going first doesn't matter quite as much, I think that's overall been a pretty solid change. Getting into some more faction-specific stuff, 2+ re-rollable saves were a thing from 7th edition that Games Workshop really shouldn't have let out the bag in the first place, I think. Perhaps the initial one was the Chaos Demon Screamer Star, but by the end of 7th edition, Games Workshop had given this to a whole bunch of different armies in their wisdom. The idea was that you create a big obnoxious Death Star type unit, stacking some sort of combination of warlord traits, relics or psychic powers to amp up your durability to obscene levels. And I think that when they were writing some of the codexes, some of them just didn't really take into account just how powerful the idea of re-rolling a saving throw could be. And it's kind of notable that Games Workshop very rarely lets that be a thing anymore, and particularly not unrestricted re-rolling all saves, usually just re-rolling saves of 1 on a few units in 10th edition. Screamer Star was certainly one of the ones that I remember one of the best. It was a 2+ re-rollable save that came from Tzeentch Demons and the Grimoire of True Names relic, which gave you a good chance to boost your saves that you could potentially re-roll. So I think it was 8 out of 9 turns you had a 2+ re-rollable invulnerable save, so basically laughed off all damage, and just 1 out of those 8 turns you get unlucky and the save will go kind of weak for the unit. It just created for really quite an uninteractive game where it was basically pointless to try and fire at that unit, and you basically had to just try and survive it, even if its damage output wasn't that great. And I feel like for a bunch of other slightly similar combos, Games Workshop had no mechanism to patch books once they were released back then. Anything that was out there and broken just persisted. It wasn't the time when they did proper digital rules updates, they barely even did FAQs. Maybe the invisibility spell was kind of similar for quite a few factions as well, meant that units could only be hit on a 6, both at range and in melee, but they could still attack normally. Again, that basically meant that any elite damage dealers just wouldn't really deal too meaningful damage to that unit. I definitely remember seeing a fair few games where people just had huge unlikely combinations of units stacked together in a big death blob, all protected by invisibility, and sort of mashed against each other, not really doing too much damage to each one. At least in 10th edition, this sort of level of uninteractivity seems to be kind of rare. Some things can be ridiculously hard to kill, but still will die to enormous focused firepower. There's pretty much nothing that's quite this obscene in terms of durability boosts. Finally, for example, today, I feel like mission design has come on really quite a lot in 10th edition over the past few editions. I feel like perhaps the epitome of a bad mission in Warhammer 40k is one where basically you can take a look at the armies, take a look at the mission rules, and basically say that yes, that army is going to win, so what's the point in even playing the game? Or having to be really quite selective if you were playing casually as to which missions you played and which ones you avoided, unless you gave too much advantage to one side or the other. I feel like some of these were more obvious than others. Again, going back really quite a long time, there were some missions back in the game that were literally just kill points completely unopposed with any other sort of scoring mechanic. Certainly nice and simple and easy to understand. Basically, if you destroyed an enemy unit, then you gained 1 point, and the player with the most points who wins by the end of the game wins overall. But it meant that you could be playing, say, an army of 5 Imperial Knights versus a big multiple small unit force that maybe had 20 units on the board or similar. So it meant that the Imperial Knights could just win automatically if they destroyed a third of the enemy force, whereas the other force would basically have to table those knights while taking pretty much no casualties whatsoever if they wanted to win on kill points. Again, that was just a format that just didn't really work too well for competitive games, and even missions that just had a very heavy emphasis on kill points and also had another scoring mechanic were kind of skewed like that. Certainly affected people not wanting to take quite as many units on the board. I certainly feel like today's more interplayer primary and secondary missions and different options and paths to victory certainly seem like they've got a bit more interest and less chance for horrendous skews like that. I think there's been a fair few examples of missions that did that to a greater or lesser extent over the years. Another one that I feel like was particularly memorable was the one that cancelled invulnerable saves, I think maybe in late 8th edition or early 9th edition perhaps, and there was basically a central part of the board where you had like a null field around it, and it basically expanded with an aura of cancelling invulnerable saves around it, which was kind of fine for most armies, I guess. They might not have too much of a reliance on them, or could keep certain units away from it if it was critical. But if you happen to be playing Chaos Demons, who basically have nothing but invulnerable saves, it was basically, yes, if you go anywhere near the middle of the board, then your army basically has no defense whatsoever and just gets removed from the board with no difficulty. I certainly feel like avoiding as many situations like that is a good move on Games Workshop's part. I feel like mission design really has come along quite a long way since that. In any case, definitely could go on with loads more examples, plenty of faction-specific stuff that I'm not too sorry to see the back of. Let me know which game mechanics you disliked in Warhammer 40k and aren't too sorry they aren't a thing anymore. As mentioned, feel free to check out the links in the video description. If you'd like some 3D printed STLs for assault segways or a modular transport vehicle with some tracks versus wheels, they're both included for $7 this month via the Thanks subscription with the discount code listed, and physical prints are available as well from Wargame Portal. In any case, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.